Halfway through the second verse, Dean lowered the microphone an inch, just an inch, and shifted his weight towards stage left. Notice that small movement, because it was the only warning anyone in the room would get before the entire night changed direction. The Silver Crown Ballroom was packed to its gilded rafters. 800 people in evening dress, sipping champagne and waiting for Dean Martin to make them forget their troubles. The chandeliers threw soft diamonds of light across the dance floor, and the air smelled of expensive cigars and gardenias from the centerpieces on every table. Crystal glasses clinked like tiny bells, and somewhere near the back, a woman's laughter rose and fell like music. It was the kind of room where problems weren't supposed to exist, where money bought a few hours of beautiful illusion, where the outside world stayed firmly outside. But Dean had spotted something in the front row that no amount of champagne could wash away, no amount of gilded elegance could hide. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? Because the story I'm about to tell you isn't about a performance. It's about the moment Dean Martin saw something he wasn't supposed to see, and what he chose to do about it, even though every instinct told him to look away. The girl couldn't have been more than 7 years old. She sat between a woman in pearls and a man whose tuxedo fit like it had been sewn onto his body by angels, and she was crying. Not the loud, attention-seeking tears of a child who wants something, not the theatrical sobbing that parents learn to decode and sometimes ignore. These were silent tears, the kind that slide down cheeks without permission, the kind that come from somewhere too deep for noise, from a place where words haven't been invented yet. Her small shoulders trembled with the effort of staying quiet, and her eyes, enormous and dark in her pale face, were fixed on Dean, as if he were the only solid thing in a world that was falling apart around her. The parents hadn't noticed. They were laughing at something, leaning into each other with the easy intimacy of people who have been married long enough to finish each other's sentences, their champagne glasses catching the light like captured stars. The mother's pearls gleamed against her throat, a triple strand that probably cost more than most people made in a year. The father's cufflinks flashed as he gestured toward the stage, gold catching the chandelier light, throwing tiny sparks across the white tablecloth. They looked like a photograph from a magazine, beautiful and polished and completely unaware that their daughter was drowning 3 feet away from them. The girl might as well have been invisible. Dean kept singing, his voice wrapped around the familiar lyrics without missing a beat, years of practice carrying him through, while his mind raced through possibilities. He'd seen a lot of things from stages over the years, marriage proposals that ended in tears, fistfights that spilled champagne across dance floors, medical emergencies that required quick thinking and quicker exits, even a birth once in a club in Vegas that nobody believed until they saw the photographs. But something about this girl's silent grief cut through all his professional distance and lodged somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere he couldn't ignore no matter how hard he tried. Listen to what happened next, because this is where the night split into 2 possible futures. Dean could have finished his set, taken his bow, collected his paycheck, and never thought about the crying girl again. That's what any sensible performer would do. You can't save everyone. You can't even notice everyone. The spotlight is bright, and it blinds you to everything except the next note, the next joke, the next wave of applause. But Dean Martin had never been a sensible performer. The song ended. The applause rose like a warm tide, washing over the stage in waves of appreciation, and Dean stepped back from the microphone to acknowledge the band with a gesture that had become second nature over decades of performance. In that brief pause, while the crowd was still clapping and the band was still basking, he made a decision that would alter everything about this evening, and everything about how he thought about his job for the rest of his life. Instead of launching into the up-tempo number that was supposed to come next, a crowd pleaser that always got people on their feet, he walked to the edge of the stage and sat down, letting his legs dangle over the side like a kid on a dock watching the water. The crowd murmured in surprise. This wasn't in the program. This wasn't in any program anywhere. Dean Martin didn't sit on stages. He owned them, commanded them, filled them with that effortless cool that made everyone feel like they were at the best party in the world. And he was the host who would never let the good times end. But here he was, 6 feet from the front row, close enough to see the tear tracks on a little girl's face, close enough to smell the gardenias on the nearest table. "You know," he said, into the microphone, his voice dropping into that conversational register he used for the quiet moments. "I've been doing this job for a long time, singing songs, telling jokes, trying to give people a reason to smile for a couple of hours. And most nights, I can tell when it's working. I can feel the room relaxing, letting go of whatever they carried in with them." He paused, and the silence was so complete. You could hear the ice settling in glasses across the ballroom. "But tonight," he continued, "I'm looking out at this beautiful room, all you beautiful people, and I see someone who isn't smiling, someone who looks like they could use a friend." Wait, because here's where most people would have panicked. 800 pairs of eyes were now scanning the room, trying to figure out who Dean Martin was talking about. The girl's parents stiffened in their seats, suddenly aware that something was happening. The mother's hand flew to her pearls. The father's smile froze halfway to his face. But Dean wasn't looking at the parents. He was looking directly at the girl, and his expression held none of the showman's polish. It was simply kind. "Hey there, sweetheart," he said softly, though the microphone carried his voice to every corner of the room. "You doing okay?" The girl's eyes went wide. For a moment she looked like she might bolt, that trapped animal look children get when adult attention suddenly pins them in place. But something in Dean's face must have reassured her, because instead of running, she shook her head slowly. No, she was not okay. The mother made a small sound of distress. The father started to stand, started to reach for his daughter, started to do whatever wealthy men do when their carefully constructed evening threatens to unravel. But Dean held up one hand, a gentle gesture, but unmistakably firm, and the father sank back into his seat. Remember this moment, because it's the first time that night when Dean Martin chose a stranger's pain over his own comfort, his own reputation, his own carefully scheduled performance. He could have let the father handle it. He could have moved on, made a joke, turned the whole thing into a funny story about a crying kid at a fancy party that he could tell Johnny Carson next week. The audience would have laughed. They always laughed when Dean wanted them to. The parents would have been grateful for the discretion. Everyone could have pretended nothing had happened, nothing unusual, nothing that required anyone to feel anything too deeply. Instead, Dean set down his microphone and stepped off the stage entirely. The crowd gasped. A murmur rippled through the room, like wind through wheat. Dean Martin was walking into the audience. Dean Martin was kneeling beside a table in the front row. Dean Martin was talking to a little girl while 800 people held their breath. "What's your name, honey?" he asked, his voice now too quiet for anyone else to hear. The girl wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of tears across her cheek. "Emily," she whispered. "That's a beautiful name. I had an aunt named Emily. She used to make the best chocolate cake you ever tasted." Dean smiled, and it was the real smile, not the one he wore for cameras. "You want to tell me what's wrong? Sometimes it helps to talk about it." Emily glanced at her parents. Her mother's face had gone pale beneath the pearls. Her father was gripping the tablecloth, hard enough to wrinkle the expensive linen. They looked like people bracing for impact, though neither of them moved to interrupt. "I'm scared," Emily said finally, her voice barely above a breath. "Scared of what, sweetheart?" The answer came out in a rush, words tumbling over each other, like they'd been dammed up too long behind a wall of silence and forced smiles. "Mama's going to the hospital tomorrow. The doctors found something bad inside her. Daddy says she's going to be fine. He keeps saying it over and over, like if he says it enough times it'll be true. but I heard them talking last night when they thought I was asleep. I was supposed to be asleep, but I couldn't sleep because I was so scared, and I went to get some water, and I heard them through the door, and Daddy was crying. Daddy never cries, not ever, not when Grandpa died, not when anything, and I don't know what I'm supposed to do if Mama isn't fine, and nobody will tell me what's really happening, and everyone keeps smiling at me like everything is okay, but I know it's not okay, I can feel it's not okay, and I just— She broke off, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks like rain on a window, and her small body shook with sobs she'd been holding back for what must have felt like forever. The room had gone absolutely silent. 800 people in their finest clothes, holding their breath, watching this private moment unfold in public like a flower blooming out of season. Every person in that ballroom was frozen in place, watching Dean Martin kneel on the floor in his expensive tuxedo, while a 7-year-old girl poured out her terror to the only person who had bothered to notice she was drowning. Notice the mother's face in this moment. The carefully constructed mask had crumbled completely. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, cutting tracks through her makeup, and she wasn't making any effort to hide them. Her husband had his arm around her, his own eyes bright with something he was fighting hard to contain. Dean reached out and took Emily's small hand in both of his. His grip was gentle but steady, the kind of hold that says, "I'm here and I'm not going anywhere." "Emily," he said quietly, "can I tell you something? Something important?" She nodded, her dark eyes fixed on his face. "Being scared is okay. It's one of the bravest things you can be, actually, because it means you love someone so much that the thought of losing them makes your heart hurt. And that kind of love, that's the most powerful thing in the whole world." He paused, letting the words settle. "Your mama is going to fight as hard as she can, because she's got you to fight for, and your daddy is going to be right there beside her, because that's what families do. And you know what your job is?" Emily shook her head. "Your job is to keep being exactly who you are, to keep loving your mama with that big brave heart of yours. Because every time she thinks about you, every time she remembers your smile or your laugh or the way you look at her like she hung the moon, that's going to give her strength. You're going to be her reason to keep fighting. Do you understand? Listen closely, because what happened next would be talked about in that ballroom for decades, would become the kind of story that people told at dinner parties and family gatherings, the kind of story that grew more beautiful with each retelling, because the truth of it was already more beautiful than most people could invent. Emily threw her arms around Dean Martin's neck and hugged him with all the fierce desperation of a child who finally feels like someone has told her the truth. Someone has seen her. Someone has given her permission to feel what she's been feeling, instead of pretending it away. And Dean hugged her back, right there on the floor of the Silver Crown Ballroom, while 800 people watched through tears they didn't bother to hide. The mother had risen from her seat. She stood there for a moment, trembling like a leaf in a storm, mascara running down her cheeks in dark rivers, and then she crossed the short distance to where Dean and Emily were still embracing. She didn't say anything. There were no words for this moment, no script to follow. She just knelt down beside them and wrapped her arms around both of them. And suddenly, it wasn't a celebrity and a stranger's child anymore. It was just 3 people holding on to each other in the middle of a storm that threatened to sweep them all away. The father joined them a moment later. His careful composure, the businessman's mask, the provider's armor, had finally cracked wide open, and tears were running freely down his face as he gathered his family close. His broad shoulders shook with sobs he'd been holding back for weeks, maybe months, and for a long moment the 4 of them stayed there, a small island of raw human connection in the middle of all that guilt and glamour and expensive champagne. Wait until you hear what happened when they finally separated. Dean stood up slowly, his knees cracking in a way that made him grimace, and he looked at Emily's parents with an expression that contained no judgment, only understanding. "I lost my mother when I was young," he said, his voice low enough that only they could hear. The worst part wasn't the grief, it was the silence. Nobody would talk to me about what was happening, what I was feeling, what I was supposed to do with all that fear. They thought they were protecting me. But kids know more than we give them credit for. They feel everything. They just don't always have the words. The mother nodded, fresh tears spilling. "We didn't know how to. We thought if we just, I know." Dean squeezed her shoulder gently. "You're doing the best you can. That's all any of us can do." He glanced down at Emily, who was clutching her mother's hand like a lifeline. "But let her in. Let her be scared with you. Let her be part of whatever comes next. She's stronger than you think." He straightened his jacket, ran a hand through his hair, and looked out at the room full of people who were still staring at him in stunned silence. "Well," he said, his voice finding its way back to the microphone someone had handed him, "I think we could all use a drink after that. Band, give me something with a little hope in it." The orchestra launched into a gentle ballad, and Dean began to sing. But it wasn't the song that was on the set list. It was an old lullaby, something his mother used to sing to him when he was small, and the world felt too big and too frightening. The melody drifted through the ballroom like a blessing, and people who hadn't cried in years found themselves reaching for their handkerchiefs. Remember what this looked like from the audience's perspective. They had come expecting entertainment, the usual Dean Martin experience of smooth songs and easy laughter. Instead, they had witnessed something rare and precious, a moment of genuine human connection in a world that usually kept such things hidden behind closed doors. Emily stayed at her table, but she was no longer crying. She was watching Dean with something like wonder, her small face peaceful for the first time all evening. Her mother had one arm around her, and her father had one arm around both of them, and they looked like a family that had just been given permission to stop pretending everything was fine. The rest of the night unfolded differently than anyone had planned. Dean abandoned the up-tempo numbers entirely, choosing instead a set list of quiet songs about love and loss, and the courage it takes to keep going when the world falls apart around you. He sang about heartbreak and healing, about the strength that hides in vulnerability, about the way love persists even when everything else changes. The crowd listened in a kind of hushed reverence, handkerchiefs appearing from purses and pockets, and when the final note faded into silence, the applause that rose was unlike anything Dean had ever heard in all his years of performing. Not the enthusiastic cheering of an entertained audience, not the polite appreciation of a satisfied crowd, but something deeper, more grateful, more real. It was the sound of 800 people who had come expecting to forget their troubles, and instead had been reminded what really mattered. Look at what happened after the show, because the story doesn't end with the final bow. Dean found Emily and her family waiting near the stage door, huddled together like survivors of a shipwreck, and he spent nearly an hour talking with them in a quiet corner while the crowd dispersed into the night, and the cleaning crew began stacking chairs. The mother's surgery was scheduled for the next morning, a tumor they'd found during a routine exam, caught early enough to give them hope, but terrifying nonetheless. The kind of news that splits your life into before and after. The father had been trying to hold everything together for weeks, to be strong for his wife and daughter, to be the rock that everyone could lean on, and the weight of it had been crushing him in ways he hadn't let himself acknowledge until tonight. "We didn't want to ruin her childhood," the father said, his voice rough with exhaustion and something that sounded almost like relief at finally being able to say these words out loud. "She's so young. She should be thinking about school and friends and birthday parties, not hospitals and doctors and—" He broke off, unable to finish. "We thought, if we could just get through this without her knowing how scared we were, she wouldn't have to carry that burden." "Kids don't need us to be unafraid," Dean said gently, and there was something in his voice that suggested he'd learned this lesson the hard way, a long time ago. They need us to be honest. They need to know that being scared is part of being human, and that we can be scared together. That's not a burden. That's a bridge. He knelt down to Emily's level one more time. You remember what I told you, okay? You're going to be so brave for your mama. And if you ever feel scared again, you just think about tonight. And you remember that there's always someone who cares, even if it's just a silly singer you met at a party. Emily threw her arms around him one more time. You're not silly, she whispered into his shoulder. You're the nicest grown-up I ever met. Dean hugged her back, and something in his chest that had been tight for years loosened just a little. You take care of your folks, kid, and take care of yourself. Notice how Dean never asked for anything. He didn't request publicity photos, didn't suggest the family tell their story to reporters, didn't try to turn the evening into a career moment. He simply gave what he could, his time, his attention, his honesty, and then he let them go. The mother's surgery was successful. Dean learned this through a letter that arrived at his home 3 months later, written in a child's careful handwriting on pink stationery, with butterflies along the border. Inside was a photograph that made his throat tighten the moment he saw it. The photo showed Emily and her mother in a garden somewhere, surrounded by roses in full bloom, both of them smiling with the kind of joy that only comes after you've walked through fire and made it out the other side. The mother's hair was just starting to grow back after chemotherapy, a soft fuzz that somehow made her look younger, more vulnerable, more alive than ever. On the back of the photograph, Emily had written in her best penmanship, "Mama is going to be okay. The doctors say she's all better. Thank you for telling me I could be scared and brave at the same time. I think about you every day. I told all my friends about the night you stopped your whole show just to talk to me. They didn't believe me at first, but now they think you're the coolest person in the world. I already knew that. Love forever and ever, Emily." Dean kept that letter in his desk drawer for the rest of his life. He never showed it to reporters who came asking for stories about his famous generosity. Never mentioned it in the interviews that filled magazines and newspapers with quotes about his legendary career. Never used it to burnish his public image or win awards or impress anyone who might have been impressed by such things. It was private, precious, a reminder that sometimes the most important things happen when nobody's watching, or when everybody's watching but nobody expected anything real to occur. Wait, because there's one more piece of this story that matters. One more chapter that gives the whole thing its proper weight. Years later, after Dean had passed away, and the world was busy remembering him for his movies, and his music, and his legendary cool, for the Rat Pack and the television specials, and the easy charm that made everyone feel like his best friend, a woman named Emily wrote an article for a small magazine. She was in her 30s by then, with children of her own, who had already heard this story 100 times, and she wanted to tell the world about the night a famous singer knelt on the floor of a fancy ballroom and taught her that courage and fear could exist in the same heart without destroying each other. "I've never forgotten what he told me," she wrote. "Not a single word of it. That being scared meant I loved my mother enough to feel something huge. That love was a reason to fight, the best reason there is. That my job was just to keep being myself, keep loving with my whole heart, and that would be enough." It sounds simple when I write it down, but when you're 7 years old and your world is falling apart, simple truths feel like life rafts. She described how his words had carried her through her mother's treatment, through the scary days when the doctors frowned at charts, and the hopeful days when test results came back clean, and the long nights when she lay awake listening for her mother's breathing in the next room. She described how she had repeated his advice to her own children when life got hard, passing down the gift he had given her like a family heirloom, more precious than any jewelry or photograph. Dean Martin was famous for a lot of things, she concluded. The voice, the movies, the easy charm that made him seem like everyone's favorite uncle. But to me, he'll always be the man who saw a scared little girl in a crowd of hundreds and chose to stop everything: the show, the schedule, the expectations of 800 paying customers, just to tell her that it was okay to be afraid. That kindness, that willingness to see someone who was hurting when nobody else could be bothered to look, that's the Dean Martin I remember. And I think that's the Dean Martin the world should remember too. Look back at this story and notice the small choices that made it possible. A microphone lowered an inch, a weight shifted towards stage left, a decision to see what others had overlooked and to do something about it instead of looking away. That's all it took to change one family's life forever. The spotlight finds who it wants. The applause rewards what it recognizes. But the moments that truly matter, the ones that ripple outward for generations, happen when someone decides that a stranger's pain is worth more than their own comfort, their own schedule, their own carefully planned set list. Dean Martin made that choice on a night when nobody expected it, when every professional instinct told him to stay on course. And because he did, a scared little girl learned something about courage that she carried with her for the rest of her life and passed on to her children. Because in the end, that's what music is for. Not fame, not money, not the polished performances that win awards and fill stadiums. Just one person reaching out to another in a moment of need, saying, "I see you, you matter. You're not alone." And now that you've heard this story, you'll remember too, every time life gets hard, every time fear threatens to overwhelm you, remember the night Dean Martin stopped a show for a crying child, and know that somewhere, someone is ready to do the same for you. All you have to do is let them see you need it.